Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are going to learn about the physiology of stomach. Stomach is the part of gastrointestinal tract that is responsible for the storage and digestion of food. To know about the complete physiology of stomach, we are going to the first slide. First of all, the location of stomach. Stomach is located inside the abdominal cavity. In which part of the abdominal cavity? For this purpose, we will divide the abdominal cavity into 9 equal parts. This part is called right hypochondriac region. This is called left hypochondriac region. This is called epigastric region. This is called right lumbar region. This is called left lumbar region. This is called umbilical region. This is called right iliac region. This is called left iliac region, and this is called hypogastric region or suprapubic region. Among these 9 parts, the stomach is located in these 3 regions: this region, this region, and this region. So we can say that stomach is located in the left hypochondriac region, epigastric region, and umbilical region. The combination of these 3 regions constitute the location of stomach. You should be clear about the word hypochondriac, which is derived from 2 words. The hypo mean below and chondric mean diaphragm. So the area which is below the diaphragm, that is called hypochondriac. So this is the left hypochondriac region and this is the right hypochondriac region. And the stomach is located in the left hypochondriac region along with the epigastric region and umbilical region. Now coming toward the parts of stomach. The stomach is having 3 main parts. The fundus, this area represent the fundus. This area represent the fundus, as the stomach is J-shaped structure. So this area of the J-shaped structure of the stomach is called fundus, which is responsible for the accumulation of gases. Normally the fundus contain the gases which are present inside the stomach. This area represent the body of the stomach. This is the body of the stomach, which is responsible for the storage and digestion of food. And this whole area represent the pylorus. The pylorus is the last part of the stomach. The pylorus consists of 2 main parts. This part is called pyloric antrum and this part is called pyloric canal. This part is called pyloric antrum and this part is called pyloric canal. Stomach is present in between the esophagus and the duodenum of the gastrointestinal tract. You can say that the stomach is located in between the esophagus and the small intestine. The sphincter which is present in between the esophagus and the stomach is called lower esophageal sphincter. You can also call it the cardiac sphincter. This is called the cardiac sphincter because this is located near the heart. This is located near the heart. The function of this sphincter is that the lower esophageal sphincter do not allow the food to go back into the esophagus once the food reaches the stomach. So you can say that the sphincter is responsible for the one-sided flow of the food and it do not allow the food to go back. Similarly, over here in the pyloric canal, a sphincter is present which separate the duodenum from the stomach, and this sphincter is called pyloric sphincter. This sphincter allow very small amount of food to get entered into the small intestine because the large amount of food which is present inside the stomach cannot be digested or absorbed at once inside the small intestine. That's why very small amount of food, very small amount of chyme, the converted food that is called chyme, get entered into the small intestine occasionally after the opening of the pyloric sphincter. Similarly, this side of the stomach is called the greater curvature. This side of the stomach is called greater curvature, and this side of the stomach is called lesser curvature. This is called lesser curvature because it make a lesser curve, and this is called a greater curvature because it make a great curve, an arc-like structure. The omentum which is attached with the lesser curvature is called lesser omentum, and the omentum which is attached with the greater curvature is called greater omentum. Now coming toward this slide, the stomach is composed of 4 main layers. The outermost layer is called serosa. This is called serosa, which give boundary to the stomach, or which attach the stomach with the surrounding, which attach the stomach with the peritoneum and the surrounding. Similarly, the second layer, this is called muscularis. This layer is called muscularis. The third layer, this is called submucosa. This is called submucosa, and the innermost layer is called mucosa. This is called mucosa. We are going to learn one by one. The serosa is responsible for the attachment of the stomach with the surrounding and to give boundary to the stomach, to give protection to the stomach, and to connect the stomach with the surrounding. As far as the second layer is concerned, this is called muscularis. This red color layer is called muscularis. Muscularis is very important layer of the stomach. It contains the smooth muscles of the stomach. In the next slide, we are going in detail of this muscularis. The muscularis consists of 3 main layers which are given in this diagram. The outermost layer of the muscularis is composed of longitudinal smooth muscle. As you can see over here, which is represented by green color, the longitudinal smooth muscle. You can also see over here the longitudinal, which are arranged in longitudinal manner, the longitudinal smooth muscle. This is the outermost muscular layer of the muscularis of the stomach. The second layer is called circular smooth muscle or vertical smooth muscle. So the circular smooth muscle that is represented by blue color over here make a circular arrangement around the stomach. These are the circular smooth muscle. This is the second or the middle layer of the muscularis of the stomach. The third layer, which is very important layer, is called oblique smooth muscle. These are the oblique smooth muscle which are arranged obliquely in the stomach. You should note about the oblique smooth muscle that oblique smooth muscles are only and only present inside the stomach of the gastrointestinal tract. Throughout the gastrointestinal tract, from the esophagus to the anus, only the circular smooth muscles and the vertical or longitudinal smooth muscles are present, but the oblique smooth muscles are only present inside the stomach. What is the main function of the oblique smooth muscles over here? As you know about the stomach, that stomach is responsible for the breakdown of food, for the digestion of food, and for the churning of food. So the churning is made by the oblique smooth muscle. By the combination of the longitudinal smooth muscle, circular smooth muscles, and oblique smooth muscle, make the stomach to churn the food, for the churning of food, to thoroughly mix the food and convert the food into small particles. Now coming toward the third layer. The third layer is the submucosa. Submucosa, as the word denote, that this is located below the mucosa, below the mucus layer. And this layer, the submucosa, is responsible for the supply of blood, for the supply of neurons, and for the supply of lymph. So the lymphatic supply, the nervous supply, and the blood supply is provided by the submucosa. Submucosa contain the nervous system, the circulatory system, and the lymphatic system. Now coming toward the innermost layer of the stomach, that is called mucosa. This is the mucosa. This is the innermost layer of the stomach. The innermost layer of the stomach is somewhat twisted. The surface of the innermost layer is somewhat that is rough, that consists of crust and trough. That is called rugae. This is called rugae. Rugae is the surface of the internal layer of the stomach. Now coming towards this layer in detail, if you examine the internal surface of the stomach, you can see the rugae with the help of your naked eyes. But if you examine deeply the internal surface of the stomach with the help of lens, you can see the small holes, like structure like the honeycomb, the small holes inside the internal surface of the stomach. You can observe these small holes with the help of what? With the help of lens. And these small holes are called gastric pit. These small holes are called what? Gastric pit. Gastric pits. So each of these gastric pits, what is the function of these gastric pits? Each of these gastric pit leads to the gastric gland. Each of these gastric pits leads to the gastric gland. So the mucosa consists of gastric glands. Going toward the detail of the gastric gland, this is a typical gastric gland. This is the gastric pit. This shows the gastric pit which leads into the gastric gland. This structure represents the gastric gland. The gastric gland consists of large number of cells, large number of secretory cells and endocrine cells. So this is the neck of the gastric gland. This is the neck of the gastric gland. This is the gastric pit. This is the gastric lumen. This is the gastric lumen. This is the gastric pit. This is the neck of the gastric gland, and this is the lumen of the gastric gland. The surface of the stomach consists of mucus cells, which is responsible for the production of large amount of mucus on the surface of the stomach. Similarly, in the neck area of this gastric gland, the mucus neck cells are present, which are also responsible for the production of mucus. Inside this gastric gland, large number of endocrine, exocrine and paracrine cells are there, which are responsible for secretion of various hormones and fluids. So first of all, the parietal cell. Parietal cell is responsible for the secretion of HCl, the hydrochloric acid, and intrinsic factor. We will learn about the parietal cell in the next slide in detail. Similarly, the G cell. The G cell is a hormonal cell that is responsible for the secretion of gastrin. As the gastrin is a hormone, so the hormone will be secreted directly into the bloodstream. That will not be secreted into the gastric lumen. That will not be secreted into the gastric gland lumen. That will be secreted into the bloodstream, and the gastrin is responsible for the activation of parietal cell for the secretion of HCl. The gastrin is also responsible for the activation of the secretory cells of the gastrointestinal tract, but primarily this G cell is responsible for the activation of parietal cell for the secretion of HCl. Similarly, the chief cell is responsible for the secretion of pepsinogen. The pepsinogen is secreted by the chief cell into the gastric gland lumen, that is later on converted into the pepsin, and pepsin is responsible for the breakdown of peptide chains, for the breakdown of proteins. In some animals like mammals, the chief cell is also responsible for the secretion of renin, R-E-N-N-I-N, renin. Renin is responsible for the breakdown of milk protein in those animals. These are not responsible for secretion of renin in the human. This is responsible for secretion of pepsinogen in human being. So the EC cell, the enterochromaffin cell. The enterochromaffin cells responsible for the secretion of serotonin on the basolateral side. On this side, this is responsible for the secretion of serotonin. This is not secreting the serotonin into the lumen just like the G cell. This is secreting the serotonin on this side to the enteric nervous system. Actually, this serotonin is responsible for the activation of enteric nervous system. And enteric nervous system is responsible for the digestive processes and the secretion and the peristaltic movement of the gastrointestinal tract. The enterochromaffin cell. The enterochromaffin cells are called enterochromaffin cells. Entero is for intron, for the intestine or for the gastrointestinal tract, and chromaffin cell is for chromium and affinity. So these cells are having the affinity for the chromium element. These cells are having affinity. So the chromium element combine with these cells and make these stand. So the chromium is used for the standing of these cells. That's why these are called enterochromaffin cells. And enterochromaffin-like cells, these are the enterochromaffin-like cells, which is responsible for the secretion of histamine. You can also call these as paracrine cells, because these secrete the histamine adjacent to the parietal cell, and this histamine combined with the receptors on the parietal cell, which is responsible for the secretion of what? For the secretion of HCl. I am going to discuss that in detail. For example, we are going to magnify this parietal cell. This is the magnified form of the parietal cell. These canal-like structure, the small canal-like structure inside the parietal cell is called canaliculi or canaliculus. I am going to write it. The canaliculus, or the plural is canaliculi. So the HCl is secreted into the canaliculi or canaliculus. That is later on secreted into the first of all, that is secreted into the canaliculi, and then later on that is secreted into the lumen over here. So over here you can see that the proton potassium channel is there. Proton potassium channel is responsible for the secretion of proton and absorption of potassium. This is actually called the proton pump, which pump out the proton and absorb the potassium at one time. It pump the proton outside into the canaliculi and absorb the potassium. Similarly, over here you can see two channels. These channels are made adjacent, but these are not normally adjacent to each other, and these channels have nothing to do with each other. This channel is responsible for the secretion of chlorine, and this channel is responsible for the secretion of potassium. So you can see over here that this potassium is secreted over here, and that potassium is absorbed over here. This potassium is in continuous cycle. You can see the cycle of potassium that is in continuous cycle. From where does the proton come to the proton pump? As you know that each and every cell of the body contain large amount of carbon dioxide, which is generated during respiration of the cell, and all the cells also consist of water. So the water and carbon dioxide combine together in the presence of carbonic anhydrase enzyme that make carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid is later on converted into the proton and bicarbonate, and that proton is abundant inside the parietal cell, and that proton is also abundant over here near the proton pump. Normally the proton pump do not secrete the proton. How the proton is secreted into the canaliculi or by the proton pump, I am going to discuss it later. You should know over here that the basolateral membrane of the parietal cell consists of a channel, and just like the proton pump, this channel is responsible for the absorption of chlorine in response to the exchange of bicarbonate. When the bicarbonate is exchanged, the chlorine is absorbed. So the chlorine comes to parietal cells through this channel, and this bicarbonate gets absorbed through this cycle into the basolateral membrane, into the adjacent cell, and the chlorine, which is abundant inside the parietal cells, come through this channel into the parietal cell, and later on the proton and chlorine combine together to make the HCl. Now coming toward the receptors. 4 types of receptors are there inside the parietal cell on the basolateral side of the parietal cell. 3 types of receptors increase the activity of proton pump or activate the proton pump to secrete the proton, and one type of receptor inhibit this proton pump. So these three receptors are activatory or excitatory, and this one is inhibitory. Number one, this is the gastrin receptor. Gastrin receptor combine with the gastrin, that is hormone that is secreted by the G cell, and that combine with the G receptor or gastrin receptor, and this gastrin receptor is responsible for the activation of proton pump. How these three receptors are responsible for the activation of proton pump? When these three receptors are activated, that these three receptors make the second messenger inside the cell, and that second messenger is responsible for the activation of protein kinase enzyme, and that protein kinase enzyme is actually responsible for the activation of this proton pump or the stimulation of this proton pump. So when these receptors are stimulated, these make the second messenger that activate the protein kinase, and that protein kinase is responsible for the secretion of proton. Similarly, this receptor inhibit the formation of second messenger. That second messenger is responsible for the activation of protein kinase, and that protein kinase later on which is responsible for the activation of proton pump. So this is the inhibitory receptor which inhibit the formation of second messenger. Similarly, this second receptor, this is called acetylcholine receptor. This is also called parasympathetic receptor. So this is also called cholinergic receptor, and this receptor is responsible for the activation of proton pump also. This is stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system. When the parasympathetic nervous system, that is called rest and digest system, that is activated, that activate the acetylcholine receptor over here, and that acetylcholine receptor is also responsible for the activation of proton pump. Similarly, this is the histamine receptor. This is the histamine receptor, and from where the histamine come? The histamine come from the paracrine cells over here, from the adjacent cell. You can see over here that this ECL cell is a paracrine cell which secrete the histamine, and that histamine combine with the histamine receptor, H2 receptor. Histaminic receptor are of two types, the H1 and H2. Over here, the H2 is responsible for the secretion of proton pump, for the secretion of proton from the proton pump. Similarly, this is the prostaglandin receptor, and prostaglandin receptor is the G protein inhibitory receptor, and this inhibitory receptor inhibits the formation or the activation of the protein kinase or formation of second messenger. Similarly, you should also know that the acetylcholine receptor can also be blocked with the help of some drugs. For example, diacyclomine is a drug. I'm going to write it. Diacyclomine. That is the drug which inhibit this receptor. And when this receptor is inhibited, this do not secrete the proton, and when the proton is not secreted, that will not combine with the chlorine, and the HCl will not be formed. Similarly, if we want to decrease the HCl by the histaminic receptor, we will block this H2 receptor. How will we block this H2 receptor? Some drugs are there in the market which are the cimetidine, ranitidine, famotidine, etc. All of these are responsible for the blockade of the H2 receptor. These H2 receptor and these H2 receptor, when get blocked, the proton pump will not be activated. Now, similarly, if we want to block this proton pump directly without the involvement of these receptor, how will we block this proton pump? We will directly block this proton pump by with the help of PPIs, some sort of drug that are called PPIs. What are these PPIs? For example, proton pump inhibitor or omeprazole, esomeprazole, etc. esomeprazole, lansoprazole, pantoprazole, etc.